You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 23rd of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Vladimir Putin is set to meet the UN Secretary-General Guterres in Russia. We'll delve into the controversial meeting and what it says about how the world is dealing with the Russian leader more than 2 years into the war in Ukraine. After that, we head to South Korea.
Hi, I'm Stephen Borwick, and I'm joining The Briefing to discuss the increasing employment of women in the South Korean economy.
Thank you, Stephen. From there, we shift to news here in the UK from the iconic Oxford-Cambridge boat race.
Chanel is very used to first times. Maybe it took a bit longer, but we are extremely proud of this partnership.
And finally, Monocle's own November Design special issue is about to hit newsstands. We'll speak with Monocle's editor, Josh Fennert, about better design, a detailed expose on sofas, and the idea of home. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Russian President Vladimir Putin is playing host to world leaders from Brics nations this week in Russia. But there is one guest beyond the leaders that is perhaps raising the most eyebrows. On the schedule for today is a meeting with United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, an invitation that has been condemned by Kyiv, but is also arguably a sign of just how much clout the Brics summit has gained over the last few years. Well, Stephen Dial is a Russia analyst and regular Monocle contributor. He joins me right here in the studio for more on the Brics summit. Good afternoon, Stephen.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Stephen, this summit is, I suppose, the global audience that Vladimir Putin will always crave. What's been your impression of how it's gone so far?
First of all, it really is that. That's for Putin the big thing. He would like to get some real results out of it, and ultimately, and everyone pretty well is convinced it's not going to happen this week, but ultimately he would like to see global economies moving to a position where they're not dependent on the dollar, because that is something that really is hitting Russia. Sanctions are hitting them. But whilst sanctions are hitting them, and he should know about that, but he's so kept in a bubble these days, we don't know how much he does know about that, he wants to be able to say, and is saying, look, here I am, I'm hosting at least 20 world leaders, plus now Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General of NATO, of the United Nations, is here. And so, look how important Russia is, because for him, Russia's importance is crucial.
It's about the symbolism, isn't it? I mean, what do you make then of the UN Secretary-General in particular going? I mean, it's an interesting one because he is, in theory, head of the UN. He's meant to be neutral in the sense of being the head of the United Nations, but he is also an upholder of the UN Charter that Russia is so clearly violating right now.
Indeed, and I will admit to having raised one eyebrow when I heard that he was going, and there's actually there now. One hopes that he's actually not just talking about the situation of Brics, but is actually talking about the war in Ukraine. I mean, this is one of the things where there's been a lot of criticism of the UN, indeed some of it coming from me, in the last 2.5 years. How can you have this global organisation with a very small security country of 5 countries that was decided back in the 1940s, one of which has started an all-out war on its neighbour? Russia, of course, being a member of the Security Council, and that no lasting regulation or law can be passed without the agreement of all the members of the Security Council. So that is a great weakness of the United Nations at the moment. So undoubtedly he will be raising the question of the war in Ukraine. And maybe this is why he's gone. Maybe this is his chance to have a meeting with Putin. Putin will, of course, then turn around and say, but look, we've got all these supporters. That's another question, that how many of these countries there are really supporters of Russia? Can I go back in history a bit? And the original idea for the BRIC countries, BRIC, was simply an acronym dreamt up by Jim O'Neill, who was the chairman of Goldman Sachs, now Lord Jim O'Neill, a member of the House of Lords in Britain. And he suggested at the turn of the century that Brazil, Russia, India, China, BRIC, were the emerging economies which should be considered, if not on a par, but were coming towards the G7 countries, the 7 most developed countries economically in the world. They first met as the acronym stuck, and then they first met as a BRIC conference in 2010, and a year later in 2011, South Africa joined them, hence the S on the end to make it Brics. But Jim O'Neill, interestingly, just in the run-up to this particular conference, has said BRICS doesn't matter. The countries don't matter. And I think when you start taking it apart, okay, so you've got the 4 original founders plus South Africa. Now you've got also Iran, United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, Egypt, and apparently coming in Saudi Arabia.
All these new ones joining. Yes.
Yeah, but there's a lot of friction between them. India and China apparently have just agreed a deal to guard their joint border, but that doesn't mean they're getting into bed together. There's a lot of friction between those two countries. Iran is generally considered by many a pariah state, and even with countries like the UAE and Egypt, Saudi Arabia, from that region, they're worried about Iran. They're not going to be welcoming the fact that they're members of the same organisation as Iran. So I think there are fractures within the BRICS structure. And then you've got these anomalies. Yes, Guterres going, that seems something of an anomaly. President Erdogan of Turkey going, that is a real anomaly. I mean, his country is a member of NATO, but he likes to keep in with the dictators. And that's another factor which produces fractures, the dictators. Putin is glorying in having this meeting there, but he's suggesting they are friends of Russia as a result. Putin is used to people jumping when he says jump, just as Xi is in China and Erdogan is in Turkey. So organisations which have these members are never going to be particularly democratic. It's rather like, last week there was the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation in Pakistan. And again, you had the friction between India and China, Russia trying to portray that as an example of, the rest of the world it's not governed by America. When you look below the surface, the cracks are definitely there in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and in the BRICS.
Well, I did want to pick up on one thing you said there about this question, which is quite crucial, isn't it, about whether these countries are supporting Russia or whether their presence in some cases is some idea that they can speak truth to Russia, I suppose. We've seen Narendra Modi of India also saying he met with Putin, made an appeal to Putin to resolve disputes peacefully. It does make me wonder if we're almost back in that pre-war in Ukraine world of saying it's better to talk to Vladimir Putin. I mean, do leaders feel like they can convince him to change his ways? Are we back there? Or is this really about supporting Russia?
I think that's an excellent point. And Modi was in Moscow just in the summer and then went on to Kiev as well. He is very uncomfortable with the war in Ukraine, and he does see himself as possibly being in a position to be some kind of bridge between the two. Kiev is not quite so happy about that, but they did accept him, even though he'd just been in Moscow. So it's interesting, it's his second visit, and I'm sure he will be pushing that button again. And in other countries, we've had attacks on shipping again, just as the Ukraine grain harvest is coming in, and they're going to be taking grain out of Ukraine to many countries in the global south. And the Russians have started again bombarding shipping in the last few days. This is not the actions of a friendly country, a country friendly to the global south, because it's that doesn't just damage the Ukrainian economy, that damages food for people in Africa and other parts of the global south. So, there are a number of things that can be pointed at by people such as Modri in Kazan saying, Mr. Putin, this is not going to bring you more friends. So Putin can say, isn't it wonderful all these countries are represented? But as I've said all along, there are great weaknesses there. And I, for one, am pretty sceptical about the long-term future of BRICS certainly as an alternative economically or globally to an organisation like the G7.
Just finally on that point particularly, Stephen, when it comes to the BRICS, as you say, and its relevance, but particularly for Russia, I'm always sort of wondering, aside from the war in Ukraine, Russia itself is not that strong an economic power right now, given everything it is doing in Ukraine, but also more generally. Why are countries so convinced of the need to put up with Russia? What about BRICS without Russia?
Russia's the biggest country in the world geographically. I think that is what it comes down to. It's about a quarter of the countries in Europe, 3/4 of the countries in Asia. It borders on an awful lot of these countries, or is very close to a lot of the countries that are there. When you look at the world from the perspective of, say, India, instead of, we're very bad, I think, in Britain. We put our map down and we always have Britain in the middle and we look out from here. Whereas if you look out from other parts of the world looks very different. And if you have this huge neighbour just to the north of you, you can't ignore it. So I think that also plays into this, that there are those countries who will be there because they want to know what Russia's up to, apart from anything else.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was Stephen Diao, Russia analyst. And now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has urged for a stop to the fighting between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah. This comes as Israel bombed the historic port city of Tyre in Lebanon, while Hezbollah launched attacks on Tel Aviv. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, has visited the country's missile bases to assess their strength. He also described the U.S. nuclear arsenal as an increasing threat to his nation. Donald Trump has accused UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Labour Party of interfering in the US election. This follows news that UK volunteers went to the US to campaign for Kamala Harris. And Japan's ruling party, the LDP, has promised to reduce the gender gap in politics. Currently, Karen Makishima is the only woman running for the LDP, and the country may fall short of its target for women candidates in the next election. Those other days' headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. In South Korea, the number of women entering the workforce has topped 10 million, according to new data released this month. It is a historic milestone for a country that has faced a certain amount of gender discrimination in the past, not to mention a sign of a strong economy, with the country's unemployment levels at their lowest since the turn of the millennium. Well, Stephen Borwick is a staff writer for Nikkei Asia in Seoul, and he joins me now to tell us more. Stephen, what is behind this record in your mind? Why are we seeing it now?
I think anything this big has to be the product of a number of factors coming together. Two that I would highlight is one, just the changing norms around gender roles in Korea. Things that are different now than they were a decade ago or 20 years or 50 years ago, in that there are just more women who are embracing their own economic potential, and they're pursuing their own careers in a wide variety of fields. That wasn't always the case. A long time ago, it was customary for women to stay home and to focus just on raising children. That does still happen, but as this data attests, there's an unprecedented portion of the women in South Korean society are going out and working. And I would say the other part of that is maybe less rosy. I think a lot of it has to do with just the consensus that there is a real need for two incomes in any household. I'd say it's a very small portion of households where just a single breadwinner is enough to allow a comfortable standard of living for a family, even if it's just a couple. Our housing prices are super high. The cost of food and energy and all the things that anyone needs to live are all really high. And most Korean companies just don't pay huge salaries. Salaries have been kind of stagnant for a number of years. And even if they have risen, I think they have not quite kept pace with rising prices of consumer goods and everything else. So this data, I think it kind of tells the story of the economy and of social change in at least a couple of different ways.
It is interesting the way you put that, Stephen. I guess that also puts into focus this idea that unemployment is at its lowest since about 1999. That's a good sign for the economy, but I suppose it also goes a little bit to what you're saying there, that many people, many families actually need two incomes and so are going into the workforce in order to sustain themselves.
Yeah, and if you look at the statistics agency we need to be clear that like they haven't clarified or haven't gone into detail about what's driving this. But when it comes to the overall very low unemployment numbers, there is data to attest that a big factor of that is that there's an unprecedented number of elderly people who are working. According to the most recent numbers, it's something like close to 7 million elderly folks who are employed, which is an all-time high. And you have to consider that against the backdrop of South Korea having a pretty low retirement age, a pretty weak pension system, and pretty high levels of elderly poverty. And so on a government level, there's been a lot of efforts to encourage elderly people to enter or re-enter the workforce because there's labor shortages in a lot of different fields in the economy. Those tend to be lower paid and less glamorous forms of work, perhaps in the service industry or in agriculture. And I think the Korean government saw older folks as an asset and thought that these are people who are still, if they're in their 60s or even their 70s, a lot of them are still physically fit and have, a decent level of mental acuity, and they're still capable of a lot. And it didn't make economic sense to have all these elderly folks not working. And so, but again, I think, as we said, with higher levels of female workforce participation, this also speaks to a kind of economic need. Surely there are a lot of, I recently did some reporting on this, and I had experts tell me that a lot of these folks are not working for, reasons of professional or personal fulfillment, but out of economic need. So we need to consider that when we look at the overall numbers.
Well, and Stephen, when it comes to the government, it's interesting, the government trying to encourage the older generation to stay in the workforce. What is the government doing when it comes to getting women into the workforce? Is there a role that they are playing in reaching this milestone as well? Or is it more about the kind of social and economic norms changing that you were talking about?
On a rhetorical level, the government has been very vocal about wanting to encourage women to work, in part because this is a quite rapidly aging society. There just aren't enough people to fill jobs in a lot of areas. And so I think there became a pretty strong consensus among experts that women were an underutilized aspect of the economy and a key tool to maintaining growth. And so you see, just if you're in public places in South Korea, you see a lot of state-led advertising promoting, encouraging women to go out and work and encouraging things like gender equality and, proper workplace conduct. Of course, in the media, you do read stories of unfortunate stories of workplace harassments and things like that. And I do think the government is trying to manage the evolutions that are taking place in South Korean workplaces nowadays. You have a quite broad range of generations. You have people who are in their early 60s and people who are in their early or mid 20s, just right out of school. And if you look at how much South Korean society has changed in the 40 years or so that are being represented there, there's people who grew up with very, very different expectations and very different cultural milieus. And so, in one workplace, you might get a quite great diversity of views and expectations, and that can sometimes lead to conflict. So I think the government sees that as something that they have a role in managing from a regulatory level and just from a messaging level. And so I think if you look at the current government, I should probably mention that like a lot of women's groups and a lot of feminist groups are quite critical of the current government because they have moved to dissolve the government ministry that is responsible for gender equality. And they've kind of said that this, because it's specifically called in Korean, like the Ministry for Women's Affairs, they've decided that was a kind of unfair a way of orienting this ministry, and they've said that they're going to come up with some kind of replacement for it. But when it comes strictly to the economy, there's something that pretty much everybody in this country agrees on, is that there's a need to keep things going, to maintain growth, and to keep as many people as possible being productive for the overall prosperity of the place. So, all of these numbers, I think, in the aggregate are probably moves in a positive direction.
Stephen Borowick, staff writer for Nikkei Asia in Seoul. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. The boat race between Oxford and Cambridge is one of the more iconic events in the UK every year, and this week Chanel and the boat race announced a long-term partnership. It marks the company's first foray into sport sponsorship. The historic race will be named the Chanel J12 Boat Race from 2025 onwards. Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco spoke with Frédéric Grangier, president of Chanel Watches and Fine Jewellery, about the new partnership and how Chanel has had its roots in sport since it was founded.
It is extraordinary and it is very, very exciting news. Of course, we just released the announcement, and I will tell you how it happened, because it happened fast in a very natural way. I'm also very happy when I see the reactions of a lot of people who say, oh, this is natural. But about first times, yes, it is the first time. But I guess at Chanel there have been a lot of first times. In 1921, Gabrielle Chanel was the first fashion designer to create her own fragrance. The name was Number 5. I think we've all heard about it, and it's still here 103 years later. And then in 1932, she was the first fashion designer to create a high jewelry collection, Bijoux de Diamant, in Paris. So Chanel is very used to first times. Maybe it took a bit longer, but we are extremely proud of this partnership.
Some people might say they might be surprised Chanel is going into a sports sponsorship. But Chanel, Gabrielle Chanel, she was a sportswoman. There was always some interest somehow in sportswear and sports itself in the brand, right?
Absolutely. We like to think that she, in fact, invented sportswear. And if we go back to her early days and the way she used men's fabrics, for example, starting with her first own store in Deauville in 1913, and then, of course, in Biarritz in the 20s, she was very much not only into sports, but water sports. And I think that freedom of movement that she brought to women was only natural from that perspective. So when I look at this partnership, I don't see it as a sports partnership. I think it goes way, way beyond, between two very iconic heritage-led houses that have been around for 1 century and almost 2 centuries, and here for many, many more years. So it's all about the culture and to some extent the timeless quality that it has. And then on the other hand, it's absolute sport, of course.
You mentioned timeless. This is a long-term investment, right?
This is a very long-term partnership, and I tell you a short story, because I really believe in science, and maybe something that is important to us at Chanel is that some decisions have to be spontaneous. We are a house of creation. You need to trust what's happening. And we first met with the race boat company on June 10th. Which was the day the first race took place in 1829. And we actually saw it as a sign. And we said, probably 30, 50 years from now, people will refer to this day as the day when the partnership started, and it's still around. So it's a very long-term vision that we have. And again, as you mentioned, this is the first time that we have this type of sponsoring agreement. So it's here to stay.
And of course, it will be called the Chanel J12 Boat Race. The watch itself was inspired by boat races, right?
Yes. So Jacques Helleux created this watch in 2000. It was a very modern watch that became iconic extremely quickly. Also, of course, in its white version in 2003. And from the very, very beginning, the idea was to have a manufactured watch that is related to water sports. Today, it's a true manufactured watch, and I think it was the right time also to bring it as an official timekeeper. And when you look at the sport itself, it's all about synchronicity. It's all about perfection in a collective effort. and it's about performance. And quite frankly, I mean, today it's easy to say because we could post-rationalize, but when I think about it, I think this is a match made in heaven, really, for watchmaking.
And I think sports in general, I mean, I believe the audience for the boat race is 250,000 of people. It's a very interesting market actually to tap into as well, right?
Also, it is taking place here in London, and the history between Chanel and the UK, and particularly London, starting with Gabrielle Chanel, is a very deep, emotional history. She was spending so much time here, and so I think it was only natural that if we were to make that move, it would be here. It would be in London, where the company is actually based, as you know,
headquarters,
not very far from here, and that it would be also between two of the great institutions in very, very different fields. So that's why it brought a real sense of pride and also humility in the way we are going to develop this partnership together. We will learn over the years. Like I said, we have plenty of time, and we just want to make it absolutely great.
That's fantastic. Frédéric, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That was Frédéric Grangier, president of Chanel Watches and Fine Jewelry, speaking with Fernando Augusto Pacheco. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on The Briefing, Monocle's November issue is out this week, among other things. It's a design special, and here in the studio to tell us more is Josh Fennert, Monocle's editor. Good afternoon, Josh.
Great to be here, Chris.
I have to start with the cover, which seems like the obvious place. You have a very specific thing you write, not only design, better design, and for everyone, this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting issue, and it may just be the fact that I'm personally thinking about the idea of home quite a lot, having just moved house with a young family and have a renovation on the cards. But this idea of home and how design can improve it really cuts through the whole issue. And it doesn't just mean getting rid of the naff wallpaper and the avocado bathroom set. It's also about those little improvements we can make to architecture that make offices better, to our streets that make our neighbourhoods better, and even the way that we run our cities. You know, home is a place where you belong. Great design can be accommodating. The way the state's designed can also be unaccommodating. I mean, we're sitting here in the UK and look at the welcome mat that's rolled out for talent that wants to move here. So we want to have a discussion about design. That does include industrial design, that does include architecture, but the issue is much, much bigger, and that idea of home also extends to how we run our nations better.
It is interesting the way that you've taken an approach to this in this issue, because when I look at it, obviously you have, as you do every year, the design top 25, for example, but then separate from that, you've also got, say, an essay section about the idea of home. I guess that gets to your point of, like, it's not just about also design in an industrial sense and like the furniture that you have in your home. It is about the concept too.
Yeah, I love that. I commissioned that. That was an idea that I've been ruminating on for a little while. We called them interior monologues. And we asked 15 interesting, notable people in their professions just to tell us about what home meant to them. And we got this amazing diversity of answers. We got war reporters who can't go back to their native Ukraine. Our own Georgina Godwin from Monocle Radio talks about the story of being a literal enemy of the state. But at the same time, you know, those ponderings come with poignancy. There's also joy and laughter and, you know, the things people witnessed as children and how they've come back to inform their careers. We've got an amazing Finnish diplomat talking about how his home is also kind of his workplace, how great Finnish design needs to speak for the country as well as his family. And you get this amazing mix of the personal and the political that I think Monocle can do great justice to. Elsewhere in the issue, I think that idea of home gets tested a little. Its elasticity gets questioned a little bit when we talk to people training, in the military in Finland who are worried about their neighbours and worried about their neighbours in a much bigger sense about what's going on the border.
Well, and it's that concept of defending your home, frankly, as well, which is something that these days we all have to, well, I guess think about a little more than we used to.
Absolutely. On the global stage, this idea of home really means something because it's not just the fixtures and finishings. It's, what would you be willing to fight for? What would the West be willing to fight for? As we look down to Johannesburg as well, or South Africa, should I say, its biggest city and its poorest city, we also talk to some of the people looking to improve the way that neighbourhoods run there. So, Monocle tries to be a place of opportunism sometimes, if you're running a business maybe as well, but a place to make things better. And I come back to that metaphor of renovating the house that I started with. Not all of the social problems can be fixed overnight. Some of them do feel very intractable, and so do our political issues when we talk about sovereignty and staying safe, security and defence. But actually the approach has got to be the same. It's got to be about looking at where we can fix things, incremental improvements, sand down the floorboards, make a warm welcome, and whether it's design or actually whether it's much bigger and it's about diplomacy, the idea of creating spaces to belong is an important thing for the issue.
Well, and just finally, we've gone very serious there, Josh, so I do have to pull you back out of that and
people don't know I'm pulling funny faces. It's radio.
Right at the end of the issue, I am, though, fascinated by, we're talking concepts here about home, but you also have this whole expo section, which is beautifully shot, which is just going quite literal. It is the concept of sofas and what they are, and just you have all these portraits of different people on their favorite sofas, what the sofa means in the home place. And that's something, if I were to channel one of our hosts, Andrew Muller, who says we always talk about chairs in design, we've taken this one step further, the sofa.
Yeah, exactly. We're thinking really long form with this one, and going much longer than chairs. I just think, ultimately Monocle isn't just a magazine, but the magazine is the real jewel in the crown of what we do. We're able to make money through it, which is great. We're able to put it on newsstands in 80-odd countries around the world. And sometimes you've got to celebrate the medium that you have in front of you. So we do a radio station, which some people listening may have heard of. We have a newsletter, which if you don't already, you should subscribe to. But magazines really do lend themselves to formats, to shooting things in a unique way, to giving the same amount of copy to each thing. And this is just a brilliant idea, given the nod by our editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, put together by Nick Manise, our design editor, to talk to people about the places that they sit in their homes, and really, when you're looking to take a load off, metaphorically, physically, the place where they sit and the way that they feel about that item. It's the kind of thing that could only come together in a magazine. It takes commitment. I think there's 12 shoots in 12 different countries. We throw the kitchen sink at covering things like this.
But it's such a central issue to the home, isn't it? It's surprising that one hasn't done something like this before.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we try consciously to hark back to that golden age of storytelling in magazines. And, I say this to anyone if they're applying for a job, if we're talking to journalism students, even if we're talking to established writers, magazines should inform, they should analyse, but they should delight and enliven as well. And I think that's what this expo section does very well. So people should take a seat of their own on their own sofas and read it for themselves.
I'm looking at Daniel Liebeskind, even architect in New York, and his impulse buy. You can read all about that on this section as well. Thank you very much. That was Josh Fennert, Monocle's editor, and that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota. Our researcher was Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Termack. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.